Okay, so I'll just pop right in because we're running a few minutes late. So I wanted to start by inviting you all to take a moment and think about the big questions. And what I mean is, I want you to think about the questions that inspired you to study psychology. Why is it that you're pouring all this effort into academic pursuit? Surely it's not money or job security. What is it that you hope to one day understand? Now, imagine that you were given just one task in life to get the authoritative answer to your big question. What would it take? How many hypotheses would you have to test? How many different studies would you have to run? How many different world regions would you have to study? And how many different skills would you have to master? It's a lot. It would take a lot. And this can feel demoralizing because academia tends to be a constrained and lonely pursuit. We typically have small labs, little funding, and difficult to reach study populations. So how could we ever hope to tackle the big question when our scientific endeavors are often forced to be so small? Across several disciplines over the past few decades, there's been a common answer that's emerged. Work together, do big team science. And we have plenty of good examples in the literature: mapping the human genome, creating high energy particle accelerators, estimating the reproducibility of psychology. Those are big questions. And their answers were only revealed to us through big team science. So you're probably here today because you're curious about this tool that we've called big team science. And you're in the right place because one of the ways that we can learn to use a new tool is to look at how other people are using it. And that's the goal of my presentation today, to show you how a group that I direct called the Psychological Science Accelerator is using this tool we call big team science. The Psychological Science Accelerator is a network of about 1,300 researchers from 80 countries. These researchers voluntarily pool their intellectual and material resources to complete large, democratically selected studies in social and cognitive psychology. As Mike mentioned in his introduction, we usually study adult humans, but I think that our approach should apply to big team science with little humans as well. So we have a variety of goals in the Psychological Science Accelerator, but today I'm going to discuss our most central one, which is improving generalizability. So think of a theory that might provide an answer to your big question. How would you go about testing that theory? Often we would start by deriving some sort of hypothesis. We would then design a study to test that hypothesis, run the study in a specific location, analyze the data in a way that makes sense, and then publish. This is sort of the standard approach to conducting research in psychology, but it leaves us with a narrow view of human nature. Because in actuality, we know there are several hypotheses that we could have derived, and that for each one of those hypotheses, there are several studies we could have run. And for each one of those studies, there's several locations we could have ran it in. And for each one of those locations, there's many different ways we could have analyzed the data. And these possibilities are multiplicative. If there were only 5 reasonable ways that we could have done each one of those things, there would have been 625 different observations that we could have made. Yet, the average research project only permits us to make a handful of those observations. And some researchers like Tal Yarkoni have called this the generalizability crisis. It's difficult to know how things would have turned out if we would have run our studies differently. And so with the studies that we have run, all we have is a very constrained view of human nature, of the reality that we're trying to study. But where there are crises, there are opportunities for growth. The Psychological Science Accelerator attempts to accelerate this growth by pooling resources in order to increase the generalizability of our research. We've done so in about a dozen projects so far, but today I'm going to discuss just a few examples. So I'm going to start with our first ever study. And I'll note that I was really nostalgic when I was making this slide because It was like looking at the baby picture of the psychological science accelerator. This is sort of where we got started, and we've grown so much over the years, but it's still always interesting for me to sort of see how it all began. So it began with this widely accepted idea in social psychology that people quickly and involuntarily form impressions of other people based on their facial appearances. That's a pretty basic assumption, but what we wanted to know is, how are people doing this? That was our big question. How are we judging other people based on nothing other than their facial expressions? According to a popular theoretical model, people make these social judgments based on evaluations of trustworthiness and evaluations of dominance. And like many psychological theories, it's been assumed that this is capturing a universal psychological process. But also, like most of psychology research, the model was developed and validated using mostly Western participant samples. So in our first study, we wanted to examine the cross-cultural generalizability of this model through a global replication. So we started with the same theory-derived prediction and used the same design. And basically what this study is doing is showing people a variety of faces and then having people rate these people on traits like attractiveness, aggression, and intelligence. And then we want to see if there's a simple, parsimonious structure to the way that these judgments are being made. So we ran the same exact design, but what we did differently is we collected data from about 12,000 participants in 41 countries spanning 11 world regions. We then used two major data analysis strategies and used both of those data analysis strategies to inform our overall conclusion about the theory. So we started by using the same principal components analysis approach that was used by the original authors. And when we did so, we found that the theoretical model generalized quite well across the 11 world regions. It definitely wasn't perfect, but it was pretty decent. We then used an alternative data analysis strategy that a lot of our reviewers felt would improve upon the limitations of the original approach. And when we did so, we found that the model no longer replicated very well across world regions. It was suggesting that the structure of these social judgments were not consistent across all of the world regions. And I can answer questions about the differences between these two models later. So this work, of course, has implications for understanding of social judgments across cultures. But the work also highlighted how issues with generalizability can be multiplicative. If we limit ourselves to just one data analysis strategy, we found that things generalized quite well across world regions. But if we used a different strategy that was quite defensible, we found that things did not generalize very well. And this can apply to any branch of the research pipeline. Generalizability is multiplicative and complicated. So you can imagine that there are certain study designs that will be highly replicable across world regions, and there may be study designs that are not. You can imagine that certain psychological processes may be relatively stable in different experimental paradigms, whereas others are not. And this kind of complexity can lead to decades of debate in science. But what's interesting about these big team science projects is that we can accelerate the pace of this discussion by pooling our resources and completing a single massive study. The next project I'll discuss is the Many Smiles collaboration, which is what we've called a PSA affiliated study. And I can talk about that distinction between affiliated and official later as well. So the Many Smiles collaboration is a global adversarial team of researchers who came together to conduct a foundational test of facial feedback theory. It's very similar to the collaborative model we see in a lot of mini babies projects. So the facial feedback hypothesis, if you're not familiar with it, refers to the simple idea that sensory motor feedback from our facial expression can impact the conscious experience of emotion. So smiling can make us feel happy and frowning can make us feel sad. When we started this project, researchers were fiercely debating whether these facial feedback effects are valid. And it's mostly because researchers had failed to replicate a very seminal pen and mouth demonstration of the effect. So to move the conversation forward, we formed the Many Smiles collaboration. What we did is we brought together a large group of facial feedback proponents, skeptics, and agnostics with 3 goals. First, we asked them to specify their theoretical perspectives regarding whether and when facial feedback effects should most reliably emerge. Second, we asked them to develop an experiment that would test these perspectives and resolve any outstanding disagreements. And then third, we challenged them to then execute this experiment at a global level. So the collaboration began with a simple question: does posing happy expressions cause people to feel happier? But as some of the many babies folks alluded to in their earlier talks, one of the first things you learn when you ask a simple question to a large team of researchers is that there isn't really a simple answer. So the collaborators disagreed about 3 major things. First, they disagreed about whether facial poses have to resemble a natural expression of happiness. They disagreed about whether posing facial expressions could initiate feelings of happiness in otherwise neutral contexts, or if it could merely amplify ongoing feelings of happiness. And then last, they disagreed about whether these facial feedback effects would be driven solely by demand characteristics and placebo. So to test whether posing happy expressions could increase happiness, we had participants pose happy and neutral facial expressions in random order. To see whether these expressions could initiate versus merely amplify ongoing feelings of happiness, we manipulated whether participants viewed happy photos while they were completing these poses. So if facial feedback can only amplify feelings of happiness, we should only expect to see an effect when people are posing and viewing pictures of puppies and rainbows and butterflies. To create more natural expressions of happiness, some participants mimicked photos of actors who were displaying highly realistic expressions of happiness. For the less natural expressions of happiness, we simply asked participants to move their lips back towards their ears. And for people who study facial expressions, they would acknowledge that this is not a genuine expression of happiness. A genuine expression often involves some activation in orbicularis oculi as well, where you see the crinkling of the eyes. And last, to compare our results to the recent failures to replicate, we had some participants complete the controversial pen and mouse task that sort of started the entire debate in the first place. So all the collaborators agreed that these sets of conditions provided foundational tests of the facial feedback hypothesis. So we then had 26 collaborating labs collect about 3,900 participants worth of data from about 19 countries. And we actually found very little between country variability. So I'm going to focus on the simple fixed effects in the next slide. So the results are graphed in a way that roughly mimics the experimental design matrix. So we have self-reported happiness here on the y-axis, and then we have facial expression poses on the x-axis. We have separate columns for each one of the facial posing tasks and separate rows for whether or not positive stimuli were present. So I'll first focus on the effects of smiling and the facial mimicry task in the presence of positive stimuli. This is telling us whether a high quality happiness pose can amplify ongoing feelings of happiness. And we found that it could. Next, we looked at whether it could initiate feelings of happiness in an otherwise neutral context. And once again, we found that it could. We found the same pattern of results when we had participants pose relatively lower quality expressions of happiness. This is the condition where participants were merely asked to pull their lips back towards their ears. And so this was suggesting that facial feedback effects could occur even if the expressions were not extremely natural and high quality. Last, there was the replication of the controversial pen and mouse task, the failure to replicate that started it all. And contrary to a lot of our expectations, we didn't find much evidence of facial feedback effects in this condition. There's a bit of nuance though. Analytic flexibility mattered here. It depended on how we handled inclusion criteria. And so this gets back to an idea that Mike talked about in his opening slides, where what we found is non-robust evidence of a pen and mouse effect, but it ultimately depended on how people wanted to model the data. But what's most important about this project is not the specific findings, it's the collaborative structure. we had several predictions, multiple designs, multiple study sites, different analysis procedures, and that all led to an extremely nuanced conclusion. One of the more senior collaborators on the project remarked that they felt like we had made a decade of progress in just a few years. So essentially what they're suggesting is that progress in science was accelerated through this big team science model. The last study I'll talk about today examined the effects of different ways of framing health information about COVID-19. So in this study, some participants were exposed to loss-framed health messages that emphasized the consequences of not adhering to health recommendations. Other participants were exposed to gain-framed messages, which emphasized the benefits of following health recommendations. After participants were exposed to these messages, they then self-reported the extent to which they wanted to engage in protective behaviors like masking, whether they supported public policies that were designed to protect against COVID-19, like mask mandates, and whether they wanted to seek additional information about COVID-19. And this was run very early in the pandemic, so we were very interested in whether people would seek additional information about a virus that was quickly evolving. In addition to testing a very applied hypothesis about how we should communicate health information, this study also allowed us to test competing hypotheses and predictions about the effects of message framing. So if you look at the negativity bias literature, some of the researchers would suggest that loss framing should lead to increases in behavioral intentions, increases in support for policies, and increased desire for information. But we had found that there were certain subsets of the health messaging framing literature that were arguing the exact opposite. So we had completely competing predictions when we walked into the study. I'll also note that as a secondary outcome, we measured self-reported anxiety, and I'll get to the anxiety measure at the end of these slides. So essentially what we had in this study is a start with two competing predictions. So we had to design some sort of test of these competing predictions. And of course, we wanted to do so in a way that would be somewhat generalizable. So what we did is we consulted a journalist and we told them about the study and we asked them to show us how they would write the loss framed and the gain framed messages in real life. And so this is our attempt to generalize what we were about to do in a more strict laboratory experiment to the real world. And we took their suggestions about how they would write this information and chose 3 of them. And we wanted to examine whether those minor differences in how a real world writer would write these messages, whether those differences would matter. Of course, we then ran the study across many countries, 84 countries in this case. And then we analyzed the data in a few hundred ways, which I'll also talk about. So here's a summary of what we found. Contrary to the predictions from both the negativity bias and the health messaging literatures, we didn't find that message framing impacted behavioral intentions to engage in protective behaviors. So I have a forest plot here where the x-axis is a standardized effect size. So positive values indicate that loss framing led to an increase in the outcome of interest. And the name of the outcome of interest will be at the top of the panel. On the y-axis, I'll have country-specific effect size estimates. And then at the bottom of the y-axis will be the overall effect size estimate, which will always be in yellow. And then just for ease of interpretation, there's a dotted line that shows you an effect size of 0. So you can see here that the overall effect size estimate is very close to 0 and overlaps with 0. Also contrary to predictions derived from the negativity bias and the health messaging literature, we did not find that message framing impacted support for 2 different types of COVID-19 related public policies. And then last, we didn't observe that the message framing impacted participants' propensity to seek information about COVID-19. This is all very surprising because there was 2 literatures that were saying this was either going to be good or bad, but neither of them suggested that it would do nothing. We observed pretty much no evidence of between country variability, which might just be due to the fact that there was really no effect to begin with. And we also found that the effect was quite similar across different wordings of the manipulation. Of course, we also wanted to look at a variety of data processing and data analysis strategies. And the goal here is to not specify which analysis approach is best, but rather to simulate data analysis approaches that we thought other people might reasonably use. So as an example, we had a 4-item measure of behavioral intention. And we figured that some people might be interested in analyzing the individual items, whereas other people might just take a simple average of the items. And so we did it all 4 ways. We asked people how they would prefer to model the data, and we got some different recommendations. Some people preferred something simple like a non-parametric Mann-Whitney U-test. Some people wanted a simple fixed effect model. Some people wanted a fully mixed effect model. So we just ran it all of the ways. We looked at some different decisions for handling outliers in the data, and we looked at some different decisions for how to handle responses to manipulation check items. So for this one outcome, behavioral intention, we had 225 different data analysis strategies. And for simplicity, what this figure does is it categorizes the significance of the p-value of the effect estimate. And it also will denote the instances where the models failed to converge, which is often indicative of some sort of problem with the assumptions of the model. So as an example, this column here shows the results from a fully random mixed effect model with data from all participants, regardless of whether they were an outlier and regardless of whether they passed the manipulation check. And for 2 of the items in the scale, the model simply failed to converge. For 1 of the items in the scale, we did find a significant framing effect. And then for 2 of the items, the average and then 1 of the specific items, we did not find evidence of a significant effect. And so you do this 225 times, and this is what you find. And what you kind of will infer when you look at this is that there's not robust evidence of a message framing effect. And if you peer into the actual specific effect size estimates, you'll find that even when it is statistically significant, the magnitude is quite negligible. And so based on all of these analyses that we were able to perform, we essentially concluded that the message framing had little to no effect on intentions to engage in COVID-19 related protective behaviors. And that was the general pattern of results for support for public policies and information seeking behavior. There was one secondary outcome though that surprised us. We looked at anxiety, and this is not very surprising in hindsight, but turns out that when you tell people about the consequences of not adhering to health recommendations, they get a little anxious. Turns out that that's also very similar across countries. People reliably get anxious when you tell them that they might die if they do not mask. And it's remarkably consistent across data analysis workflows. And that was nice for us because the summary that we were able to give at the end of this study is that we did not have robust evidence that this message framing manipulation had an impact on any of the outcomes of interest in the literature. The negativity bias literature didn't correctly predict this. The framing literature didn't correctly predict this. We found no effect on behavioral intentions, policy support, or information seeking across a variety of countries in a variety of different ways that the message could be written. But what we did find is that this led to unintended increases in anxiety. So when we were discussing the implications of these findings for public policy and for theory, we were able to put a lot of confidence in the generalizability of our results. Framing messages in terms of losses as opposed to gains is not going to increase any of the outcomes that we measured other than anxiety. So these 3 studies give you a flavor of how the Psychological Science Accelerator is using big team science. We're using it to increase the generalizability of our studies. And I share this information today because my hope is that one way that we all can learn how to use this tool is to trade information about how we're using it. So far, what we've learned in Psychological Science Accelerator is that big team science is a very powerful tool. It can bring people together to better explicate theoretical predictions. It can bring people together to design more informative and complex experiments, to collect data from multiple world regions, to explore complexity in data processing and data analysis. But what excites me is not what we've done, but what we're going to do next with big team science. And the reason why I'm so excited about this conference today is because I think that the answer is partially up to everyone in the audience. And I wish I could be there today. You all are the ones with the big questions. And so now I challenge you to bring the big team science. Thank you. I'll take some questions and I have a quick closing remark after questions, or we could do questions later. I don't know how it's formatted, Heidi.
I think we could take a couple minutes if anybody has any questions for Nicholas while we have him, you know, the settings correct and stuff. Does anybody have any questions or any reactions to anything Nick just presented? Yeah, Rick, go ahead. Can you hear us okay, Nick?
I can hear you. I'll see if I can hear other people.
Okay. Okay.
I'll use my theater voice, Nick. Hi, great talk, Rick Gilmore. So I have a question because this came up when I talked about the many analysts kind of papers and studies. How did reviewers react when you talked about this approach, or how have they reacted when you say, look, we want to try many different analytical approaches and combine them for inference? Because I think that goes against, you know, much of the analytical training that many of us receive, that of course we have to be worried about the risks of false positives with multiple comparisons. So I'm just curious how others reacted to that approach.
Yeah, I was actually a little surprised the reviewers weren't that concerned about it, to be honest, which I thought we'd get a little bit more pushback. But I think one of the reasons why they weren't so concerned about false positives is because we made it clear that we weren't going to base our decision off of the results of any one analysis strategy. So you have that increased false positive if you're going to run 100 analyses and then pick the one that you like the most. But it's better controlled for if you're going to say, well, no, I'll run 100 analyses and I'll base my conclusion off of all of them. So I think that was one thing that helped address those reviewer concerns. And the second one is that even though the plot that I showed today was a little overly simplistic and just showed significance and non-significance, what we actually reported in the paper was a range of observed effect size estimates. And so I think that that also helped address the concerns, is that we said this is, you know, really sort of about estimation and about being transparent about how these differences in data analysis strategies might impact conclusions. So that helped us so far, but I've heard other stories of more difficult reviewers than the ones that we faced for that project.
All right, any last things before we introduce our next speaker?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, okay. Nick, if there was something you wanted to end with, we can do that.
Oh yeah, just really quick. I just, you know, as we continue to go through the session, and I'll be here for the rest of the session as well, or most of it, I want us to always go back and think about those big questions. Because I'm still very early in my training, but there's times where I think about that big question and the answer seems unobtainable. It seems like I can only take baby steps and then hope that someone will pick off where I left off. But one thing that I've learned through big team science is that we can do more than take baby steps. We can make leaps in scientific progress if we're willing to pool our resources and combine the power of many minds. And I'm excited about this session today because the potential collaborators are in this room right now. And today could be the start of something bigger than all of us, the start of a bigger and more team-oriented developmental science. So I'm just excited, and I want to thank you all for letting me be a part of that journey today.
All right.